I'm Jeff Hennig from Teachers College. I'm formally playing the commentator role. I'm not a journalist in the nonprofit world, but our other panel members all are. So we have at my far left Sarah Carr from the Teacher Project, next to her Sarah Garland from Heckinger, and right to my immediate left Matt Barnum from Chalkbeat. And I think the best way for us to start and get things going is for each of them to just give a little bit of a background on their organization, and then we'll ad-lib from there on.
Should we start with our spiels?
Yeah, go with the spiel.
As Jeff said, I'm Sarah Carr, and I oversee the Teacher Project, which is an education reporting fellowship that started 3.5 years ago at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and like all of the initiatives here is foundation funded. We're going to talk a little bit just about without going into the weeds, about the distinctions between the organizations where we work at. The Teacher Project has two big purposes. The first is to produce great education journalism, which publishes at Slate and The Atlantic and WNYC and NPR and a range of outlets. And the second, which I think makes it distinct from both Heckinger and Chalkbeat, is that we see ourselves partly as a training program. And with the exception of myself, all of the staff are very recent graduates of the journalism school who are in early stages in their career, and this is seen as an opportunity for them to do much more ambitious, in-depth, deeply reported education journalism than they would get to do in a typical entry-level position. And our hope is that over the course of long and successful careers that they'll go on to use some of what they've learned both about education and about journalism at the Teacher Project to really be leaders in the field. We exclusively do, or fairly exclusively do, project reporting and not breaking news. So we spend months on a story, and we really try and focus on a couple of, I think I switch on for a second. We try and focus on a couple of underreported areas each year. Last year, we devoted a lot of time to covering online credit recovery and alternative education. And we also emphasize teacher and student voices in our reporting. That said, pretty much everything that we've done, without exception, is really steeped in a lot of conversations with researchers. And in the early months of reporting online, the online credit recovery package, for instance, we talked to quite a few researchers. But that was an area where we felt like there was very little out there that focused on the student experience in those courses, so that the final product emphasized those voices. I think we're going to dive into a conversation on the changes in the education journalism landscape, but just to give you a couple of my broad brush thoughts. I think that the two big trends in education journalism have been a decline in local news media, coupled with somewhat of a positive increase in national outlets that you could look to potentially to disseminate your work and ideas. But when I started covering K-12 education years ago at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and at that time I think that there were 7 full-time reporters on the beat, and now there's maybe 1.5 covering higher ed and K-12 education between the two of them. But at the same time, there are a range of national outlets, like the Atlantic, that would be a good example, that have, because of the web, have expanded their education presence and are doing a lot more than they were doing 5 or 10 years ago. And there's also been the rise in what I would call kind of education-only mainstream news outlets, which the three of us represent, and they're mainstream, and that we're trying to reach a broad audience. We're not trying just to reach teachers or academics. And I think that they're a funny hybrid in that the reporters tend to gravitate to them because they do have this really deep interest in education and might have more of a background in that on average than the education beat reporter at a big city daily. But we also, as I said, are trying to reach a broad audience with our work. In terms of the implications for education research and education researchers, I think that there are fewer local and regional outlets for disseminating your work, and there's no question that will probably continue for some time. But I think that overall there are more opportunities at the national level, particularly if you factor in kind of the huge world of education bloggers. But you need to be somewhat of a savvier consumer of the news in terms of figuring out who to approach and how and which journalists are really worth your time in terms of building a relationship. And as a start, I think there are maybe three questions that you might ask. The first is, who is the intended audience of this news organization or blog? And it differs maybe a little bit for the three of us, but there would be an even bigger distinction between us and Education Week, which is trying to reach more practitioners. And then a second question, and this one is very tricky, but I would put it as, are they trying to be nonpartisan? Like, I think that nobody is 100% objective, and we all bring sort of biases to the work, but there is a real distinction to be made between foundation-funded news outlets that see it as part of their mission to be nonpartisan and ones that don't. And then the final question is just, how do they cover research, or do they cover research at all? And for instance, with the Teacher Project, we would love to connect with you about a specific set of subjects that we're reporting on this year, but we're not the place to go if you want to get quick coverage of a report or a research debate that's in the news. With that, turn it to Sarah Sparks. Is that right?
Sorry for a little delay. I'm Sarah Sparks. I'm an assistant editor at Education Week, and I also cover inside school research.
I'll go next. I'm Sarah Garland. I'm at the Hechinger Report. I'm the executive editor, and we have been around for a very long time, since the 90s, started out as a training organization, and the goal was really connecting, especially new education beat reporters, to researchers and research, and making sure they really understood a beat that's incredibly complex often. And we held training sessions for years until we sort of hit the mid-aughts and realized that there was a huge decline in the number of journalists who are coming to sessions and who are covering the beat. And there was also funding, and I think this is also an important trend. There were funders interested in actually funding a publication that focused on education rather than a training institute that was training journalists who are already out there in the field. So I was the first hire. I was the first staff reporter in 2010, and we launched not too long after Chalkbeat launched, and so we were part of this sort of new, not so new idea and sort of model, because public radio has been doing this forever, but we were relatively new digital-only outlet that was focused on a single topic, one, education, and you've seen a rise of many of those now in other areas, and also this model of taking foundation money, doing nonpartisan, independent news coverage, and trying to find a place on the web. And the way we did that was by focusing on partnerships. So from the very beginning, we were interested in doing in-depth, research-based education journalism. It was fairly broad at the beginning, and disseminating that reportage to the general public via partnering with outlets that they actually read, not the Hechinger Report. So we had a very sort of bare bones website at the very beginning, and we had a lot of connections with journalists around the country. And that's continued to be the way we work, is the idea is that we're funding really high quality, really in-depth journalism around education, and we do both investigative, solutions-oriented journalism, explanatory journalism, where we're sort of looking at trends or ideas and models and understanding how they work. And we then find the right outlet. Ideally, we're looking for the audience that we think is the right audience for this story. And I'm in charge of partnerships, and it's sort of a very, I think your position, most of you I think are researchers, and I imagine are here also to sort of learn how journalists, decide what's a story and so on. And that's also in some ways my job, is figuring out which outlet would be interested in this story. Is it a good fit for reaches an audience of people that we want and think this story is important to reach? And so we're doing increasingly more local and national partnerships, where we're trying to find a local outlet where people who are in the school district that we're writing about are reading about this, but also we're reaching a wider audience beyond that. And I would say yes, there's been this huge decline in journalism generally. At the same time, you have these really great spots of hope, which are the increase of the education verticals at different outlets. There are new national outlets that didn't exist or were very small when we started operating. And we recently created a network of local outlets around the country. We're trying to hit all 50 states. We haven't quite yet. It's a combination of traditional newspapers, public radio outlets. Chalkbeat is one of our partners, and then some digital-only outlets like the Texas Tribune is one, the Lens in New Orleans, which are sort of investigative, policy-oriented news outlets, VT Digger, that are kicking along and doing really good work and getting foundation funding and a lot of sort of individual reader money as well, and working with them because they're reaching really important audiences in their states, often the state house. Everyone in the legislature and at the governor's office are reading these outlets, and we've seen this growth of these new kinds of outlets. It's really exciting amid the depression of the general journalism industry. So that's how we've evolved, and as we've seen sort of this growth of new education-specific organizations out there and also verticals, we've also tried to figure out what is our niche at Hechinger, because we both have a website that we've tried to cultivate and grow, and we have this partnership model, and we've increasingly sort of figured out what are we doing that other folks aren't or don't have the capacity to do, but need, and where there's a great interest in the reporting that we're doing. So we're focused on inequality and innovation, and we sort of see those as the two most important issues in education, is the inequality and the different ways that manifests itself in the U.S. education system, and then sort of what are the ideas out there for fixing it. Do they work or not? And so we've really sort of found our groove doing that kind of reporting, and do a mix of both the reportage, which is really our bread and butter, but also a lot of columns and shorter pieces looking at data that we're really interested in. We try to find areas that aren't getting as much coverage elsewhere, and then also take a lot of opinion and try to sort of have a robust conversation on our site of a lot of education researchers, but also public intellectuals and thinkers in the education space, so that there's also a conversation happening on our website about these issues. And I'm very hopeful. I think that there's been a lot of changes to social media, which have hit independent news outlets in a big way recently. But I also think just the opening up of partners and outlets that, the New York Times years ago when we first approached them was very iffy about working with a nonprofit news outlet, and now is working very frequently with places like the Marshall Project and ProPublica, and we're working with them on their new education quarterly and helping them design that. So I think you've seen real change, and I think that's good for journalism when you have people partnering, bringing together ideas and resources and capabilities. And I also think there's a new growth, and we'll hopefully talk about this, of working with researchers too.
Great. I'm Matt Barnum. I'm the national reporter for Chalkbeat, also a nonprofit news organization. I think the Sarah's really set this conversation up nicely, and I'm going to echo some of what they said. Chalkbeat is a little different than a lot of the other nonprofit news outlets in that we have bureaus in several different cities and states. Chicago is one of our newest ones, Colorado, New York City, Detroit, Tennessee, Newark, and Indiana. Sorry, I didn't want to forget any, so I wrote them all down. So that's what, 7. And then we have a national desk, which is me and soon to be another reporter. And so our local teams function similarly like as traditional beat reporters, like a traditional big city newspaper would. Sometimes they're, in competition with the big city reporter. Other times the big city papers have just all but gotten rid of their education reporting, and much of their coverage is simply taking Chalkbeat news stories and republishing them, which is unfortunate. Good for us that they're republishing our stuff. Outside of Chalkbeat, I think the move towards a nonprofit journalism means that there's going to be more subject specialization and less place specialization. And I think that's very similar to what Sarah Carr said. And I think that has both upsides and downsides. It means that the people who are covering education likely have more of a background in education and have more subject-specific knowledge about education. I think that's actually especially good when it comes to covering research. It's more likely that someone will have more of a background in research studies and be more familiar with the research literature, but it also could mean that they have less context when applying research findings. So like a specific example might be like if you're a local reporter and you want to cover, and your district is proposing class size reductions, what you might do is like find a researcher who will say, are class size reductions good or bad? And that's a very simplistic way of doing it, but you can understand why a local reporter isn't going to like be able to or have the wherewithal to like go deep into the class size research literature. Whereas like a national reporter may cover like 2 different studies on class sizes coming to different results and why that might be. I think that's great, but there's also a risk of less context when applying a research finding, national research findings to a local place. So local reporter may have better context of, well, the national research says this, but there may be some specific reasons in my district that I know a lot about why this may be less applicable. The one thing I'm especially hopeful for with the subject specialization is a move towards covering research and researchers not just as experts or experts say or study shows, but covering them as traditional sources and sometimes critically. Sometimes that means looking at a paper and saying, here's another researcher who's criticizing this other paper. Here we got several people to weigh in. So more sort of coverage of research itself in the evolving body of research rather than just one-off like local story with like an expert says. That's something I'm hopeful for. Understanding the, I think, huge downsides of the loss of local context. Chalkbeat, I think, is very lucky that we are able to have some of that local context, and our local reporters can work with our national team to be very well informed about research and research trends and applying it in their local context. I think the other big issue about the rise of nonprofit journalism is funding. And I think because I believe we're all largely foundation-funded outlets, and that comes with some challenges and downsides. And we obviously do not want to romanticize the previous system, which has in many places not proven sustainable. I think it's something of an open question about to what extent is the foundation funding a sustainable model as well. There are, of course, the questions of conflicts of interest, because the foundations who fund us, for example, like the Gates Foundation, funds Chalkbeat. But the Gates Foundation is a major player in education policy. So I want to, as a reporter, and I'm able to, aggressively cover the Gates Foundation. I have no idea whether the Gates Foundation or any foundations would sees that as a good thing or a bad thing. Would they pull funding because they don't like a story? I've never experienced that, and I've never had an editor say, not close to it. In fact, my editors want me to write aggressively about the foundations who fund us. But that's a real question. I think the bigger question beyond just, oh, are they secretly in our office telling us what to write? The real issue is who they're funding and who they're not funding. And there's just a selection of who they decide to fund. And I think that influences the types of places that we see more coverage, the types of trends that we see more coverage in, and the types of approaches to journalism that we see more often from nonprofit journalism. And I say this descriptively because I think that as not necessarily good or bad, because I think they have both upsides and downsides, but let me give a couple examples. So one is Chalkbeat. We have bureaus in several places. Those are places that have been funded in part by local philanthropy who want Chalkbeat there. And Jeff and I were talking the other day that some of those places are places that education, big education philanthropies who are supportive of charter schools are really excited about places like Denver and Indianapolis. Those are places where they are telling people across the country, you need to replicate Denver and Indianapolis. Things are going great there. I don't think it's a complete coincidence that there are also Chalkbeat chapters there, and there are not Chalkbeat chapters in Akron, Ohio, or some other places where there's less sort of philanthropic energy. Again, I think it's actually great that we have coverage of places where people are saying we need to replicate this model, but I also think that means we're missing out on some other places. Another topic that I think is covered often by nonprofit outlets, myself included, is personalized learning or tech-based digital learning using computers to, advocates say, improve and differentiate education. That is something that a lot of major philanthropies are extremely excited about, particularly the Gates Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and they're pouring a lot of money to promote that model. We see, I think, a lot of coverage from the national outlets on this, and a lot of it is quite positive, some of it less so. I think that's an example where who philanthropists and foundations are choosing to fund may contribute to the weight of coverage. Not at all saying that people are being told you must cover this, but simply the selection of who's being funded and who's not being funded. And then the last example is a trend in journalism, and I'm not entirely sure if this is connected to the nonprofit stuff or not, but the idea of solutions journalism. So focusing on what works rather than just exploring what is not working or investigating corruption. And I think there's a lot of interest in the philanthropic world in saying in supporting solutions journalism. And again, I think that comes with both upsides and downsides. So look forward to the conversation.
So as I alluded to earlier, I'm not a journalist, so I do want to say something about maybe why I'm on the panel. But if you'll let me start with a loopy little anecdote that makes a couple of points, and then I'll get back to being on point. So I wanted to come out and say something. I have very clear memories from when I was much younger, and the actor Robert Young, who played a character, Marcus Welby, a doctor, on TV doing a commercial in which he was there in a white lab coat and he said, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. And then he talked about Sanka and the advantages of decaf coffee. I have very clear memory of that. I've heard many people reference it since. I thought, oh, I'll start off with that anecdote. But I decided to Google a little bit this morning just to get my facts right and dates right, and it turns out that there's a huge controversy over whether this ever happened. Some people were saying, no, it wasn't Robert Young, it was this other person. Other people said, yes, Robert Young did it, but he wasn't wearing a lab coat. He didn't say he was a doctor. And part of the issue was people were looking on YouTube for the commercial, and of course this was way pre-YouTube. So I just found that really interesting for this panel in a few senses. One is, it's really hard to actually figure out the facts, and so I have a lot of respect for journalists who actually look into things behind the stories that are out there, because this was a story that I was sure was true. And you can't even rely on the recollection of the people you're interviewing in a lot of instances there. I also thought it was interesting in terms of the social media angle and the whole change in the environment in which we all get news and the competition for the various kinds of journalism that are out there that is very different today and creates some kinds of pressures, competitive pressures that maybe we'll talk about. Now, very quickly, I came at this partly because as someone who studies politics of education and charter schools, I was doing research on the issue of how research gets used in controversial public debates. And one of the things I found just from my own experience was I would often talk to the researchers on the charter school issue, and on both sides, and they'd have pretty nuanced views that recognize some of the complexities. And then I'd see stories in the media that seemed like, quoting these same people, but seemed like they were presenting a much more polarized and simplified set of pro and anti positions. And so I began as part of that project to look more at media as one of the ways our work as researchers gets out into the public sphere. The other thing I take to this issue is the interest, and Matt alluded to it, but I have a general interest in the role of philanthropies in the education reform movement. Philanthropies, foundations, and also large donors, and the intersection of all these issues as they relate to how word gets not out just out about research to the public, but also about what works and what doesn't work. And then finally, just on a personal note, I happen to live in a family dense with journalists. My wife's a journalist. Both my daughters are journalists, my son-in-law, my nephew. And so we talk a lot about this. So I have like the true researcher's pile of anecdotes and stories in terms of the changes in the nature of journalism, the competitive pressures out there, and I also amass gossip.
So since I came in a little bit late, I'll just give you a brief rundown. Education Week has been covering education and covering education research for decades now, and we still are overwhelmingly subscription driven, but we've also accepted foundation support for a very long time. And typically, the reporters aren't really involved much in that. The editors figure out what areas are getting to be hot in the education field, what things we're hearing from educators and in particular school and district leaders, and look for people who are willing to fund us in those areas. And that sometimes helps because we've done some fairly critical studies on various funders, including Gates, which sometimes they're okay with, sometimes they're not okay with, but we don't really have much connection to them for that. So that's been okay so far. I think it has been interesting to watch the way funders interact, not just with journalists, but with researchers and with the school districts that they are working with over the past 15 years or so. And I think that interest in individual school districts, in a way, the dark side of finding a good solution for a problem is if one district or one network seems to be finding a solution, even if the research is fairly early or might be more like a pilot, you see a sort of glomming on of multiple different funders, multiple journalists and outside interest groups interested in them, which is great, and it does give more support for people who are trying to do interesting work, but can also change how that is perceived, even if it's an intervention that's still in fairly early stages. And so I'm interested in two trends that are affecting researchers and education journalists both right now. One is this move toward data, both our own use of data as journalists, and a fair number of journalists have never taken a statistics class, do not know how to use SPSS, and we're changing that very rapidly. Our professional organizations like Education Writers Association and Investigative Reporters and Editors, if you're not familiar with them as researchers, it might be helpful for you to become familiar with them, just because these are the groups that are trying to elevate the research and data literacy of our profession. And that's happening at the same time that I think a lot more social scientists and education researchers are also getting their feet wet in this huge big data. And I think that as both professions move forward, there's an opportunity for a lot deeper and more nuanced understanding of both why something is working at a particular site and why it may or may not work in the school district that you're covering at the moment. And that sort of context is something that researchers can be incredibly helpful in giving context to journalists. The other thing is we have never been faster, I think, at being able to fact check, and we have never had such a difficult time as researchers or as journalists having that matter. If you check facts and it doesn't make any difference, or if you show this research and this research show this and this research show this, and it really doesn't end up having any bearing on the debate, that can be incredibly frustrating. And I think some of the moves towards solutions-driven journalism, some of the moves toward implementation science, they're all efforts to develop the context around which we can explain things in ways that people not only understand, but inspire them to act on that understanding. So that's kind of where I am, and as the moderator, I just wanted to get some questions going. We'll have a limited discussion here, and then I want to find out what you guys are interested in. I guess my first question is sort of building off that. Could each of you talk a little bit about the specific partnerships you have sought with researchers, or at least with large data sets, and how that sort of thing is shaping your coverage now more than in the past, if it is? And you might start, since you guys do a lot of partnerships.
We do a lot of partnerships, and I will say I've been impressed with some partnerships that I've seen between journalists and researchers, like very close, like doing the work together, and we are interested in doing that. We have not successfully made that jump where we're working, you know, before a story publishes with the researcher on, we are interested in finding out if X. What we do is a lot of data work, and we've sort of, so the intern who started when I started as a staff writer 8 years ago is now our investigations editor, sort of worked her way and trained her way up to being very proficient is not quite the word, and excellent at working with research and data. And so she does a lot of sort of running things by, like, I'm doing this, can I do this? I'm gonna try this, is that cool? Like, does that work, with lots of different researchers? But I do think there is an interest in, you know, that question of, like, we don't do SPSS really very well on staff, and like, or we're not comfortable enough that, like, we feel authoritative and feel like if we did an investigation that it would hold water, to do something a little bit more complicated than the data work we do, which is pulling together data sets, doing a lot of cleaning, and then, you know, sort of analyzing, but sort of taking that next step toward, like, is there a correlation between this and this, that kind of thing. But, you know, there's an interest there, which I think is new and exciting, but also difficult, because you also have to find a way to work with folks who are in different timetables, you know, in terms of the work they do. There's a different sort of process, you know, just the publishing process is totally different. And also finding people, you know, I think there are, you know, folks who may be, you know, very, very well-versed or very, you know, have a lot of expertise in the area, are the guy for this, but also may have a really strong voice on Twitter and social media and would be seen as partisan, even if they, you know, they've done their research and this is what they found and so on, but like partnering with that person because they're sort of seen as in this camp is problematic as journalists who really want to come at this as, you know, we don't know yet, we're going to find out, and we won't necessarily know the answers, we're going to present what we found. And I just want to also add, I mean, with the solutions journalism lens, we helped write the book on how to do solutions journalism for the Solutions Journalism Network. And it's this new idea. I feel like it's something we should sort of explain a little bit since we're talking about it. It's this idea that you're looking not just at sort of what's wrong, which is often the journalistic lens, is accountability journalism, or we're going to hold people's feet to the fire, or we're going to cover what happened just now and you're going to know right away. There's this sort of new idea that we should also be looking at what works, and or what people say works is often the, you know, people say, you know, charter schools, will use the very bland example, are working. Let's go investigate that claim. And so people are holding this up as a solution. Is it? And our job as journalists is not necessarily to sort of go and rah-rah cheer on an idea that people are presenting as a solution, but to go and investigate, you know, what is working, what's the evidence behind the claim that this is a solution, and then is that question of like, would it be replicable? What are the resources or the people and so on involved? And we also like to do it. We do a lot of positive outlier. So we have actually a couple of staffers today. We're doing a project, and I was like, well, why don't, instead of us like sort of figuring out what is the thing that's sort of trending right now, like let's find a school that's like had some surprising outcomes in the measure that we're interested in, and find out what they're doing. And we did that with some high schools. We were looking at their graduation, like where are some like high schools that have gone from really abysmal graduation rates to really great ones, and what did they do? And it's often actually very complicated. And it's not just this one thing, but it's several things, and it makes for very interesting stories. And so we see that as sort of a very useful journalism that hasn't gotten as much attention, and also as a part of investigation. So we do a lot of investigative work where this is wrong, and we think it's important to also say, but it doesn't have to be this way, because look over here, they figured it out. And they made some really big gains. We did this with a child care series where we looked at Mississippi's terrible child care system. And then we went to the Department of Defense, which used to have a terrible child care system, and said, like, how did they like go from abysmal to the best in the country? And like, what were the steps they took? And that sort of like creates a different narrative, instead of like, you have this terrible problem, there's nothing that can be done, everyone's to blame, to, well, over here they did something different, and here's how that worked, and maybe there's some lessons that can be learned.
Yeah, just briefly, as I mentioned, you know, we don't have any formal partnerships with researchers, but we have sort of emerged into a model where the reporting fellows spend the first part of the fellowship really getting steeped in what the research body says about the topics that we're focusing on that year, and then hopefully later in the fall or the winter sort of get out in schools and get more at the grassroots level with that broader context and background shaping their observations. I do want to just build on one point that that Sarah, the other two Sarahs have touched on, and that is I think it is a major development, the interest in mainstream journalism communities in data and using data better in reporting. I mean, the journalism school for the first time ever started a degree in data-based journalism this year. And so that is something to think about as researchers. And I think is kind of reshaping newsrooms, large and small, on a range of topics, and it's seen kind of rightly or wrongly or in between as sort of one of those areas in which you can be more marketable as a journalist these days. But it is a real trend that's happening.
Yeah, we haven't, at Chalkbeat, we haven't done that sort of formal partnership. I would just echo Sarah G's point about the tension between potentially formally partnering with a researcher who you probably want to have an arm's length relationship just because they're a source and you're writing about their work and you want to be able to cover that critically. And I think that's just a tension, and that doesn't mean that you can't do the partnership. That's just something I think that's important to be cognizant of.
Could you talk a little bit, Matt, about how you find researchers when you're looking for sources?
Yeah. So most of my coverage of research is focused on a specific study. And a study comes out, and then I write about the study. So to partially answer the question would be like, how do I find the studies? And so that's a very important thing. And the solution that I found, which is super easy, solutions journalism here, is just subscribing to the main journal email alerts, the main education research journal email alerts, and that has just been a godsend. I also get studies sent to me. So then, you find the person who wrote the study. The other way, if, let's say there's a topic I'm writing about that isn't study specific, but I want to look into the studies on a topic and I don't have a good basis, if I can find one study, then I can look at the work cited and the other studies that are being cited in that area by the researchers in that area. And then you can just start going down a rabbit hole. Oh, this looks like a good study. What studies did that study cite? And usually you'll find a really large body of research very quickly. Then the biggest challenge is sifting through that. Okay, I have 15 studies on class size reduction, and 10 say one thing and 5 say another, and they use different methodologies, and who should I call? That's where it's a challenge. Fortunately, I've been covering research for a little bit now that I do have some research. I do have a good body of researchers who I know well and who I trust and who I say, oh, I'm looking at this area. Who are 2 or 3 people you would recommend? And I would love a variety of perspectives on this.
I think you've done a little work on how reporters interact on stories. Could you talk a little bit about your study?
Yeah. So yes, I'll say something, and then I warned Sarah also that I'll sometimes probably ask a question myself rather than just give an answer. I mean, one thing that I did look at in terms of the charter school coverage was who got quoted, on the research. And I did it partly because there was a hypothesis out there, one that I heard from a lot of researchers, which was that journalists always just want one person on one extreme and one person on the other extreme. People talked about the fact that if you're going to write a story quoting an astronaut up in space talking about the beautiful curve of the Earth, then you've got to go out and get someone from the Flat Earth Society to give the other perspective. And I found a couple of things. One is that didn't happen. That wasn't the structure of most of the articles covering research. It wasn't a two-sided thing. It was more often talking to the researchers who had done the study, which I actually found myself in some ways problematic because I think some of the sense that the public has, the skepticism that the public has in terms of research, is this sense of serial finding and then counter-finding. So a report comes out and charter schools are good, report comes out charter schools are bad, report comes out teacher accountability is good, a report comes out teacher accountability is bad, and that kind of sort of erodes over time, just the same way, is it salt that's good for you or wine that's good or bad for you and things like that. So I was very interested in this issue of whether there are ways, and this is one question, whether there are ways for journalists to cover a debate broadly rather than a particular study, and what are editorial pressures and time pressures and resource pressures that make it, and readership interest pressures that make it hard to do that.
When I cover a single study, my goal is always to cover it in the context of a broader literature and the development of the literature. And I see every new study as sort of moving a field forward, moving a literature forward. And I'm very cognizant of what Jeff just mentioned, the sort of whiplash effect of studies. You know, this study on topic A says it's good, and another study says it's bad. And so I try really hard to try to explain, like, did you just read another story 2 weeks ago, maybe also in Chalkbeat, saying that X, Y, and Z is good? Well, here's a caveat from this new study, or here's why this new study in a totally different context found something different. Or who the heck knows, these two studies of the exact same thing found something different. And this is just one of the complications. So I think that's a very, very important point. And I also think it's important to sometimes step back and say, this is a topic that is being debated. Let's just take a bird's eye view of the literature. And so I did a piece on the research on school vouchers. And I did a really comprehensive piece that probably cited 24 or so studies. And now every time a new significant voucher study comes out, I update the piece with like that finding and say, okay, here's what we've learned. And sometimes that even tweaks the sort of top line takeaway. Not only am I adding to that specific study, but maybe that changes the takeaway. And I'm hopeful that that can be seen as a resource for readers if they're looking to follow a literature. Sarah Carr, you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe getting at Jeff's point about some of the editorial pressures, like they are real. You know, I had my first position covering charters and vouchers in Milwaukee, where I wrote a lot of news stories about voucher research and would get very heated pushback from the teachers union on one side or voucher proponents on the other if they didn't feel like there was a total balance in terms of what they perceived as pro-voucher researchers and anti-voucher researchers quoted in the pieces, and would complain to editors on the drop of a hat if they felt like that balance was skewed in any way. So I do think that there are...
Or was not skewed in the way they wanted it to be skewed. Let's be honest.
Exactly. But it is very heated, and when you're in any place, there are sort of relationships and dynamics and editors who are friends with some people, and it is a fraught political environment at times for reporters trying to do it right and to be balanced. I mean, I was thinking just in terms of charter research also, I mean, one thing I think that journalists can do that's really helpful is to try and get space whenever possible to, if you're writing about, let's say, a charter outcome study in New Orleans, to include both the local and the national context. Because for readers who know nothing about charter schools, they don't know that sort of charter laws vary as much as they do, and the overall average strength of a charter sector can vary quite a bit depending on where you live. And so I think that's something that oftentimes reporters, particularly at local mainstream outlets, have to fight to get, but keeping in mind sort of how difficult it can be in such a decentralized school landscape as we have in the United States to speak very broadly about much of anything, and the importance of viewing that context as multi-layered, and trying to get both very local and national context in pieces is important.
Can I make one other really quick point about the issue of balance? And there is really the risk of false balance. And if there's a research literature that the research consensus is clearly in one direction, reporters really need to be able to say that and, you know, show their work and say, this is what I'm citing, this is what I'm relying on to make this claim. I mean, obviously the classic example is with climate change, right? You don't want to call up the one climate change denier and say, well, experts on both sides disagree. In education, I experience that covering the debate on whether school spending matters. And there have been probably almost a dozen studies in the last 5 to 6 years that have almost all shown that additional school funding is causally related to better student outcomes. So it's just not a good practice to say, well, you know, one researcher says it does matter, and then one researcher, Rick Hanushek, says that it doesn't matter. If there's a literature in one direction, you have to be able to say that and cite that and make that claim.
So when do you counter and how do you counter researchers who are making a claim that you feel is a little outside the norm?
You just don't cover.
You what?
I mean, it's a choice of coverage, and I think there are different ways. I mean, there's the news study says coverage, where you're covering the latest research, and then there's the we are doing a story about this topic, and we want to know what the research says about this. And there's sort of two different ways that where you're using research, I think. But you know, I think we were discussing the other day a weak study that was part of the context or that was new, and how do you sort of mention that with the caveats? And like, you have to be very aware of those. But I was at a conversation with a panel like this one with another reporter at a major daily who was saying, you know, she noticed a problem in a study that it came to her, and so she didn't cover it and doesn't trust that researcher anymore because there was a major, you know, there's an error. So I think it's, you know, very cautiously, and is this worth a story, especially if it has problematic findings?
Yeah, I think the predominant response, including from me, is to not cover it or to not quote the person, which I actually think is not necessarily the ideal response. I started reporting a story on this study on New Orleans and charter schools and public transparency in the charter schools there. And I was excited for the study. I reached out to charter school advocates in New Orleans to get their comment on it, and they pointed to a significant error in the findings. And so I was like, well, some of the findings are still maybe legitimate, but then I just dropped it. Maybe if I had more time, I would have reported out this study, which was published in a peer-reviewed journal, had a major error, which the researcher acknowledged to me and said, yeah, they're right, this was a mistake. Obviously, we're stretched for time in this sort of like very in-the-weeds debate. Issue of this one specific study is of less interest to a national audience, so I had to pass, but it might have been nice to actually be able to write that up and to call out low-quality studies or studies with significant errors when you find them.
One other point, I mean, what I took from your summary, Jeff, was that when you looked at the charter, they weren't doing it as he said, she said, but they were basically just summarizing the research findings, that was the most common model.
The most recent study.
Right.
Okay, they would just sort of summarize it. Yeah, I mean, one other, I think, development over the last several years, and I think there are some good things and some bad things about this, is I do think there are more outlets and more of an open mind about journalists kind of putting their analytical take on pieces. And I mean, I think that, you know, if you're writing a piece for the Atlantic Education vertical, you have quite a bit of latitude in terms of summarizing or putting your analytical take in the way that I would not have had when I was writing a piece 10 years ago for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel or the New Orleans Times-Picayune. So I think that it can be helpful when you have somebody who is striving to be open-minded and nonpartisan and has a lot of background and is steeped in this research and context, but it can also be problematic when you have somebody who's not.
I want to open it up for questions from the audience.
Hi, my name is Jamal Abdulalim, education editor. Thank you. I don't have a teacher voice, so I appreciate the microphone. Jamal Abdulalim, education editor at the conversation. One of the things I was hoping that you could speak to is how often do you get the sense that you encounter researchers who have an agenda, and the agenda is kind of indicated in some of the inferences that they make based on their research? I'm not asking you to name names or anything like that, but more along the lines of speaking of how you deal with that. And that kind of leads to the second question, which is, you know, we all have pressures as journalists, and we have pressures to produce content, and researchers, I imagine, have pressure as well. And I'm surprised sometimes at just the frequency at which a study or a researcher can find a particular thing versus the outcome is, you know what, we didn't find anything of interest. You know, that's not very exciting. No one is going to write about that. And then so they massage the data, and then somehow we have a finding. So if you could speak to those things, just those pressures, and then also dealing with researchers where you detect that there's an agenda. Thank you.
I find a continuum. I don't know about you guys. There's the people who I don't call very often because I already know what they're going to say before I call them, because they always say the same thing. And even if it's a study on something entirely different, they'll find a way to get back. I also find very frequently the total opposite. The studies and researchers who seem to have found something, and I'm interested in exploring what it is, and either they or their press office want me to talk to them or want to allow access to them, but when I get them on the phone, they're like, well, so here's the p-values, and here's the set, and I'm like, great, can you tell me a little bit more about that? How would you put that in terms of lay terms? And I understand the difficulty for researchers of not wanting to go beyond the research, and I appreciate that. But it sometimes seems that they're not always clear on what maybe they're not clear on what they're putting in the abstract versus what they really believe their findings were. And that can cause some issues. I don't know if you guys see the same thing. Or
I agree with you about the spectrum, and there are some researchers who, when you talk to them, it's death by 1,000 caveats, and it's just like caveat everything to death. There's no external validity. This study was done in Los Angeles from 1999 to 2004, and you can't generalize or learn anything beyond those dates, and obviously that's in the past, so sorry. And then there are some who are like death by 0 caveats, and it's like, this study is maybe a good study, but you need to acknowledge some of the serious caveats to the study, and there's no acknowledgement whatsoever, and that's also a big problem. The other thing about the dealing with researchers with an agenda, I think this is a very, very difficult thing, and most researchers do have an agenda in some sense or another. They have personal views that shape what they research, how they conduct their research, what policy conclusions they draw about that. And some researchers are very vocal and clear about what they believe in terms of policy. And some of those researchers also do extremely high quality work, high quality, rigorous work that they may draw certain policy conclusions from. Regardless of that, the work is really good. And so one thing I try to do is bucket two things. What did the study find, and what are the conclusions? What can we learn from the study? What are the broader conclusions from the study? And the researcher may have their own opinion about what the broader conclusions of the study are, but that's not the only opinion, and they actually may not even have any special expertise on what the broader conclusions are, even as they're the biggest experts on what the study found. And so I think it's very, very important to demarcate that, and it's also important to be cognizant of the researcher's agenda without necessarily eliminating or not covering high quality good research because you know or believe that a researcher has a point of view. There's nothing wrong with that in itself.
I'd also add something that's been really interesting to me lately is reporters have always understood about agenda. right? We've always understood that whoever you're talking to, they have their point of view. Sometimes they've got a really strong incentive or a conflict of interest. But it's been interesting watching the evolution of more stories on just the replication problems, issues of researchers falsifying data that weren't necessarily associated with them having an agenda from a political or a social sense. It was their agenda was getting published.
Right.
And it has been interesting watching the journalism field starting to explain more to their readers. Okay, so this is how it works. This is what was going on in this particular scandal. And I think that that's really great, beyond me just being geeky about it, really great in terms of helping the public understand all of the context that might be going on in research. I don't know if...
I think, and I'm going to link this back to the nonprofit journalism hook for the panel, which is one of the interesting things I've observed is a lot of these newer outlets are ed specialists, and they've got journalists who have been in the game for a fair amount of time. Whereas historically in some of the major media, the ed beat was a low status beat. You had a lot of turnover in terms of who got it. It was like one step up from the crime blotter, but you know, people aspired to cover the hot national issues. And so some of that kind of sophistication, I think, does come with seasoning and seeing these things come and go and knowing yourself who are the actors. And so I wonder, some of the folks on the panel have worked in both, you know, I've worked in the nonprofit versus the for-profit realm. I don't know whether that's the issue or it's just this issue that education has because of No Child Left Behind and some of the other issues that have brought it up to national attention has become a beat that people stick with longer.
Sarah, did you?
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think there is an element of, you know, the beat as a, like, that stepping stone beat. Like, I went from, well, I actually went from education to police at this end. But yeah, that sort of, like, it was my first job, right? As a real reporter, I was covering education. And it was like, anybody can do it. Like, you know, you have no experience in education at all, but that doesn't matter, like, you know, because anybody can, like, show up at the meetings. And I do think, like, we now have, there's a fairly, and there's a lot, I mean, I think this was probably always the case, but there's a lot of young reporters who really are into this beat and really want to do this. And I think some of that is, you know, the controversy, and, you know, all of the money that's being thrown at education now and towards sort of controversial new ideas. And people really want to get in on that. And I think, you know, a lot of reporters are in this to write about, like, the inequalities in the system and, you know, segregation and I mean, you see so many story ideas coming across my desk on those issues. So I think there's the journalists who get in it, which is a lot of them, to change the world, like the sort of idealistic journalists, like, see education as the way, like, the prime beat for covering, like, the reason they got in it in the first place. And now there's more outlets that sort of allow for that. At the same time, you know, I talked to a journalism class recently, and I was like, please don't try to stay in New York and assume you're going to get a job covering anything at all, much less education. And at the same time, you know, there's all of these really fantastic new digital-only local outlets that are popping up that are very serious and very focused on policy, but they pay terribly. I mean, they're very, you know, they're nonprofits. They're not unionized. They're very small. And so I think, you know, where you may have this, you know, group of us who are sort of in it for the long haul, you also have, you know, these new jobs that are popping up that aren't sustainable and, you know, for people who want to eventually have a family and, you know, afford their rent. So.
Yeah, no, I do think that No Child Left Behind and
sort of maybe in the Obama year, sort of the hotness of the debates over education reform did help raise the prestige of education reporting, and there was maybe between about 2008 and 2013 or so, there was a series of stories by pretty high profile, like Steve Brill, kind of dove in and did this education piece, who hadn't previously written about education. And I think our outlets have played a role in raising the prestige of the education beat as well, and also you might consider reader surveys that newspapers have done. Education tends to rank high in terms of areas that people want to read about, if not the highest, definitely up there. I mean, one of the things I really worry about, though, on the flip side, particularly when it comes to local outlets shifting more and more of their resources and their publication capacity to the web, is just that education does not tend to do well in terms of story clicks. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes when it does at local outlets, it's some hyper local story about a popular principal.
Teacher sex scandal.
Yeah, not really the kind of things that I think any of us think would add sort of widespread depth or understanding to kind of the most urgent debates. So that is, and I mean, I think it's something that it's sort of incumbent on us to think about, is how to, if we're going to put all these resources into creating this really deeply recorded education journalism, how to partner with places and make sure it actually gets read.
Just as an anecdote, my first education reporting job was covering several school districts, tiny school districts in Connecticut as part of a geographic beat, and it was right after NCLB had been passed. And there was so much that was relabeled in the district, so things like what you guys would think of as supplemental education services, the tutoring services that were really big and had a whole lot of money thrown at them under NCLB, they had their own local names. And I think I got interested particularly in education as a part of my beat, in part because there were all these kind of shady groups that were coming in and offering tutoring services. And I mean, we have found out since that was very widespread in its problem. But something that researchers can really be helpful with, particularly for local reporters, and there are still a lot of education reporters who are doing education in a local newspaper. This is not to say that they have died out as a breed, even though they are rarer than they used to be. But having a researcher who can say, oh, that program that is called Happy Tutoring in your district is actually this, and this is where the through line is. I think that can often, and that noise to signal ratio problem becomes even more so when you add in the online and different things being called different things. Any other questions?
Thanks very much. Been enjoying the session. I'm from Sydney, Australia, and I work in a very busy research environment, so we engage with the media quite a lot, and I talk to journalists a lot. I've been hearing a lot in this session about the external factors, and in some cases pressures that play into, so whether something's funded or not funded, profit or not for profit, various policies, No Child, and all of these things, what researchers do and don't do, and what the researchers' agendas are and are not. When I talk to journalists, and I do that a lot and have done so for many years, one of the biggest things I need to cut through as a researcher are the internal pressures of the journalists. And so, for example, if I'm talking to, and we all have these and we all have our personal views on things, researchers do, that's what inspires their research program. But for example, and in very subtle ways, for example, a journalist who, and I'm in the area of child development, for example, a journalist who has not had children may have very unrealistic views of what parents should or shouldn't be doing. A parent who does have children will have different views on how things should be done. A parent of a boy or of a girl, for example, if there's a boys' education program.
I'm sorry, what's the...
So the question is, how do you navigate and manage your own personal views and around child development, around learning, around schools, and around teachers? How do you navigate those views when it comes and reconcile that with research, for example, that might not be in line with what you believe personally or think personally?
Sarah Carr? No. You've spoken on this before.
When it comes to, there's no question that nobody is ever going to be purely objective, and we're all going to bring our biases, and I think, it starts with being transparent about that to yourself. I think it's the most scary thing would be to have somebody who thought that they were 100% objective, but one of the things that
have them be the president.
I know. One of the things that I've noticed just is that the more, for me personally, the more you know about a subject, the harder it is to have sort of absolute perspectives. And I think that's one of the reasons I've enjoyed writing about and reporting on education for so long, is that it just, the more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. So I think kind of living in that gray area and kind of seeking out stories that sort of illuminate this kind of vast grayness are part of the reason that I personally really like the beat.
Hi, thank you guys for your work and for today. I work in teacher preparation, training our next generation of teachers. So a lot of my work is around translating work around brain science for teachers, and so it's actionable. And I often refer them to Chalkbeat and to Hechinger Report to stay on top of their field. And one thing that we come back to a lot is that there is not so much coverage of how learning happens and what's going on in the brain. And so while all my students who are training to be teachers, read to stay on top of it, it ends up being a lot about politics and history of education and politics, which is important. But we're often looking for places where today's 20-year-old teacher in training can go to get some research translated in a really fun and sort of approachable way. So I guess my question is two parts. One, do you guys think about teachers or future teachers as your audience, or do you mainly think about your audience as the public? And sort of the conversations around that. And then the second idea about, education, K-12, that when it's covered, a lot of it is the politics and context, which is so important. But to what extent do you think about covering, learning, how learning happens, and all the exciting things that are going on in that field?
Can I jump in right there?
Can I jump in first?
You can go first, Sarah.
No, the moderator.
I know, sorry. Well, one, we have both, we see our main audience is not the public. It is primarily teachers, principals, district administrators. So it's in that area. And we actually do cover a lot of science of learning, a lot of emerging research fields, including brain science, including some of the social and emotional stuff. All of that has to be there's the stories about here's this emerging research and here's what implications it might have, but that's also one of those really delicate places where half of our stories end up being, here are the neuromyths that are still hanging around since the 80s, and no, there's not a left brain and a right brain, and here's the science behind it. And I think particularly in emerging research areas, we do at least as much debugging the bad stuff and stories about that as talking about the emerging research trends.
I was going to say we have a Science of Learning column that we have, and it's huge. I mean, people really want to know, I mean, just generally how your brain works, right? And so I think that kind of coverage is catnip for readers, and mostly teachers, and we're trying to get it refunded, so maybe I'll get a letter of support from you. It's because it's really important work, but I think, you know, in terms of teachers as audience, it's one of those things that I think about a lot. I don't think most of our audience is teachers, actually. You know, I think, at least for the Hechinger report site, there's certainly a lot of people who work in, I mean, most people work in schools, higher ed or K-12 or early ed. But I know the stories that teachers pick up from it. Like, so the teachers, the stories that teachers care about are the sort of how-to news I can use in the classroom stories. And so there's this, I mean, so I think for us, there's a tension there. Because if I did you know, the Magic 8, what was this headline? Magic 8 something was in it was the Magic 8 bullet, you know, magic bullet preschool something. It was like this amazing headline about like exactly what you need to do in preschool classrooms that make them great. And so of course, I mean, it did fantastically well because, you know, preschool teachers want that information, like desperately need that information. At the same time, our mission is not necessarily that role of, you know, translating research findings so that teachers can use them in the classroom, and our role is covering inequality and, you know, innovations and sort of the policy around that too. And so I think we have these different conflicts always and dilemmas about like how much do we do that's teacher friendly and how much does that overlap with some of the other policy work that we're doing that we think is really important, that's bigger picture and more systemic, that isn't necessarily going to affect the I'm planning my lesson tomorrow kind of work. Not that teachers aren't interested in that. I think we just know that those stories that are, you know, information about like this is how teachers are designing their classrooms in a way that really helps them, you know, do this sort of new innovative teaching method that like teachers are going to click on that on Facebook. So it's a tension, and I think that there's a huge demand for it, and I don't know exactly how to fill that with also filling the other roles that we do, which is educating the general public about like these urgent issues in the education system and like policy issues that that we want to have an impact on.
Hi, I'm John McDonald with UCLA these days. So I think a lot of the nonprofit organizations have done some great work in terms of covering issues of equity and civil rights. But I'm wondering, as you look at your capacity, how do you assess your ability to cover communities of color and to access researchers that are Black and Latino and Asian, and in particular to look, you know, deeper into the issues that impact those communities? You know, is capacity an issue for you? And what thoughts do you have in terms of developing new expertise and, frankly, building your capacity to do so?
Do you want to talk about that?
I'll give it a first pass. I mean, I think to Sarah's earlier asked me, you know, how do you find researchers? And so one thing that I try to be very intentional about is finding diversity of researchers in terms of race and gender. And it is easy to rely on, you know, some of the same celebrity researchers, sometimes, not always, but sometimes white males. And so I think that has to be done very intentionally. I think in terms of covering communities of color, in terms of just whether you're going to cover districts with a lot of students of color, like that's actually very easy and straightforward because some of the most like controversial and interesting policies are going on in big cities where most students or nearly all students are communities of color. So in fact, there have been some discussions that like rural schooling has been left out of the coverage area. I think that's a separate discussion about to what extent are you covering those communities of color well and with local context, et cetera. But fortunately, in some sense, from the journalist sense, you know, the big issues that we're often covering are in districts with lots of students of color.
One of the things that, one of the things that we've done we go everywhere, so we sort of go to places that don't have a lot of news, or we go to places where there's a lack. We've done a lot of coverage in Mississippi, for example, but also go, try to find places where there hasn't been a lot of coverage and there's not necessarily robust news media, because that's where we're needed. But we've also done some efforts at training our own sort of staff, so working with interns who are from a place that we're writing about. I've sent out, solicited ideas from local reporters on topics that we're covering, so that we're getting ideas from places, and it's not just us deciding from New York that we're going to go cover this town in Texas, but getting ideas from local reporters about what's interesting in those communities. But I do think there's a lot of work to be done, especially around that question of reaching, and it's something we're thinking about a lot. Like, how do you reach the people who are generating and creating knowledge in communities, and making sure that their voices are heard in our opinion pages and in our research coverage and then in our general reporting.
And I think a key aspect of that is also just diversity within our organizations, and that's something that I think is important to all of these organizations, and there's been varying levels of success at varying times, and that is currently sort of a hot topic in the Education Writers Association more broadly, is how to get more diversity within the ranks of education reporters. And I mean, I do think partnering with local news organizations is really key, but it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of times those local news organizations don't have the trust of communities of color in those places. Like, one of the most undiverse newsrooms I ever worked in was a local news organization. So
it's funny, very recently we've been doing reporters have been auditing their own sources, and we're coming together and having conversations about, okay, here's who, not both by race and language and area of the country, but also things like, just, am I always talking to these universities, or am I always talking to on this subject but not on this slightly related subject? And I think that has to be an ongoing discussion that is going on both among the reporters and among the editors, and it has to be somewhat, not necessarily entirely formalized, but there has to be some sort of structure to make sure that that's something ongoing, because it's really easy when you are trying to churn out stories every day to call the people that you know will answer and will speak coherently in sentences you can quote. And I mean, in a way, that's the biggest bias we have, is the need for somebody who can talk to you when you need to talk to them, and can say things in clear sentences. And that's also something we have to work with, because there are people who have great ideas that are not as comfortable working with journalists, and that you need to sit with for a while.
One of the interesting things about nonprofit journalism is there is often a pressure from foundations. So there's a new sort of, one of the good pressures, I guess, is that they're looking, not just at what our coverage is, but is it a diverse staff? And that's actually something that we have to answer to. Is
there a training though issue for you guys in terms of being able to prepare reports to work with diverse communities?
A training?
Yeah, training development for young reporters that we see in nonprofit fields.
I mean, EWA does some things around that. They have a working group. The National Press Club has done, but I don't think, if what you mean is, are there those sort of things in journalism school? It's been a long time since I was in schools, but I don't know.
So institutional development within your own organizations as well, for that kind of support or ongoing approach to how you do that. I don't need more time on this issue.
I don't know. You, and then you.
Stephen Corrin, U.S. Department of Education. I just had an example of some cooperation between government and press that ultimately led to a solution. I just want to cite it, give you 2 seconds of feedback. It's from Ed Week. There's a variable called private contributions in the Common Core data. It's not very well reported. And we met with Alex Harwin and Mr. Rodriguez, the Ed Week staff, and they pointed out this problem to us because they had run it through the school district finance survey. It's all public data. And so we went ahead and read on the record and said this is all volunteer data. We're working to improve the reporting on the variable and collecting on the variable. But that was an excellent meeting in that they came prepared. They had run all the data across the districts in the United States, and they set out the problem to us, and we turned around and we're trying to improve the reporting on that particular data. So I just want to give you that as a really good example. And just one quick question. We give out reports on an embargo basis, and it was actually Jill Barchet from Hechinger that indicated it might be a better idea to give out these embargoed reports with more than a couple days prior to the release date. I'd like to ask the whole panel whether or not the release, we should give out these embargoed reports 3 to 5 days, 5 to 7, or because right now it's about 1 or 2.
Just to be safe, like a couple of years.
Yeah, like all of the time. Like if you could just tell us when you give the grants, here it's now embargoed and you'll be getting, no.
I would say 2 weeks for me is ideal, but a couple days is okay.
Yeah. I mean, literally, I talk to researchers when they get their grants, and then when they're a couple years in, and I keep on them.
Yeah.
But that's not the same thing as like a big NCES release or something.
Yeah. Hi. I am from Education Week, and I actually have a question for you, Jeff, which is I was at a media literacy, an aspect of that came up in one of the sessions that I was at yesterday. And I am wondering, because I think this does have a role for researchers, but in terms of your students, or maybe just generally at TC, this idea that there's also a lot of advocacy journalism out there in the nonprofit space, and I think people don't always recognize that. And I think in an increasingly siloed universe, especially when it comes to news, how you guys are talking about that, what you're hearing, maybe people are aware of it, I have no idea. Just curious.
I started teaching a course this past fall on the politics of research, and this was one of the issues we gave a fair amount of time to. And it's a tricky one because at the same time you've got advocacy research and you've got researchers who are advocates and who are pushing a point of view. The professional associations, including AERA, are actually trying to send a message to researchers that we should all be going out and getting our voice out there as well. And it's partly a reflection of the fact that the overall political funding environment is hostile to research now, and so good researchers should be going out and getting their voice in there. But there's some real, and this may not be directly responsive, but there's some real delicacy that needs to be addressed in terms of how do you train doctoral students, for example, which is what we're being told we should do, or master's students to be more coherent in talking. But that often turns out to be telling them to go back to bullet points and simple points and to distill away the complexities of the issues. And so I don't have an easy answer to how do you sort of have socially responsible research that does try to talk to the public, socially responsible journalism that tries to sort through these hidden agenda issues. But I do feel a pressing need for us to figure it out.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Anybody?
And it's a short one. how do you evaluate research to determine whether or not it is something that it makes sense to cover, or whether it's something that you need to look at more carefully? Do you rely on your own experience? Do you call other researchers? Do you talk to other folks that you work with? I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the process. You touched on it, but I'd like to hear more.
Anybody want to take that, or you want me to take that?
I'll just answer briefly. I definitely look for red flags and positive, if there are some things that might be red flags if a study is clearly not causal, but it claims to be causal or has suggestive language that's causal, or like suggests it's causal until you look at footnote 11 where it's like, well, to be sure, this is not causal, but we've been using the word like consequences throughout that may confuse people. And then just having a basic, and that's all I have, a basic understanding of research methodologies. I can look for like things that seem credible, and also having a knowledge of what folks are regularly publishing in what seem to be high quality peer review journals. I do think it's a best practice to share new studies with other researchers, particularly non-peer reviewed working papers. Not that I think peer review is a great proxy for quality, but we'll hold that aside. And so I love to share a study with an external researcher and say, what's your take on this? What do you think of the methodology, et cetera, et cetera. I have varying degrees of success with that because sometimes researchers don't want to go on the record talking about other research that is out there in their colleagues, and so sometimes I can get thoughts that are helpful off the record. Yeah.
And I guess just more generally, it is very contextual what, aside from basic quality or interest, it depends on what larger story I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. You might be doing all straight observational studies because you're just trying to get a sense of how something is working, or implementation studies, or neuroscience where you then have to explain, okay, they have really small n's here, like it's problematic. And so there are always researchers at these conferences who are like, oh, well, you wouldn't be interested in my research, or, oh, I've tried to pitch this research, but nobody wants to hear about X. And I really think a larger array of research could be interesting as long as the researcher isn't thinking, I'm going to get an entire story written about my wonderful study. Any final words from any of you guys? Thank you, guys. It's been it's been a nice conversation.